Welcome to the English Without Borders webinar series, and we are going to start our today's webinar. So we are very happy to introduce our today's speaker. So let me briefly introduce our speaker today. So let's meet our speaker today. Today we have Lisa Howard, and she is one of the outstanding TESOL teachers who is doing quite well job around the globe. And so Lisa today is going to present her topic, acquiring English proficiency through stories. So Lisa has finished an MA in TESOL in 2002 and has taught students of all levels from preschool through university and beyond. And for the past decade, she has been using stories to teach English to young learners in Hungary. Lisa has written, edited, and revised ELT materials for several major publishers, ministries of education, and language learning programs. She is the co-editor of the TESOL Materials Writers Interest section newsletter and a frequent presenter at international conferences. So today, Lisa is going to tell about very interesting facts, and also her presentation will be about how our brains wired to retain information through stories, and learning through story really activates creativity and develops important social emotional competencies. And in her presentation, she will tell why stories are a compelling and effective way to teach English, and how to co-create stories with students. And also she will share suggestions on how teachers can preserve these stories and use them for further listening, speaking, reading, and writing exercises. So welcome, Lisa. And I would like just to remind our audience that they can put their questions in the chat box. And also we have followers who are watching the webinar from the Facebook live stream. So please use the chat box to ask your questions to Lisa. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Lisa. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And thank you everybody for attending this evening. So I'm excited to share this with you. This is something that I've been doing actively for the last 10 years almost, using stories to teach my students here in Hungary. So I teach primary, I teach grades 1 through 4. And I hope that what I do can be applicable to your own context. So I've tried to include a balance of theory and practice so that you can understand the theoretical side and really gain hopefully some motivation to include stories or narrative or anything you can that's more of a story based and more of a narrative to help your students learn and acquire English better. So without further ado, let me find my screen so we can get started. Oh, there we go. Reduce this. So acquiring English proficiency through stories, I want to draw your attention to the use of the word acquiring. There's a difference between acquiring and learning. When we acquire language, it's subconscious, it's easy, and there's a focus on meaning. When we learn English, it's the opposite. The focus isn't so much on the meaning, but the focus is on the structure. And it's a lot harder for a lot more people to learn when the focus is on structure rather than meaning. So when we can focus on acquiring and meaning, it helps the learning be subconscious, which makes it deeper and really more effective. When you look at this picture, what comes to mind? What do you think of? Do you think of vocabulary lists or grammar structures, or does your brain automatically try to find the meaning? You want to know, who are these people? What is their relationship? What's the background? How did they get to this point? How is this going to end? What is their role in all of this? So our brains automatically try to find meaning, and they try to find the story really in everything we see. But why? We don't do things just for no reason. Everything we do, every part of our body and our existence exists for a reason, has a function. So what function could stories possibly have? And why did we develop this ability? So to think about this, I'd like to go all the way back to some of our earliest ancestors who 30,000 years ago were already drawing stories on the walls of caves. And that's really something that set us apart from other species and it was a key feature really in our progression as a species. And attributes aren't developed unless they're needed. So what function do stories have? They give our lives meaning, they comfort us, they make the world bearable, they give us purpose, and they bind us socially. So stories give us comfort. They explain the inexplicable. They help us understand everything from the simplest action of a bird making a nest to the more complex questions of what our purpose is of life and what our very existence is meaning. Stories bind us to others. They create social connectivity, which is vital for our survival as well. Have you ever felt social pain? We all have. And we don't feel pain, again, for no reason. If you touch a hot stove, it hurts so that your brain knows to pull your hand away so you don't get hurt. So social pain is really a survival strategy. When we feel that pain, we adjust our behavior so we fit in socially. So stories bind us socially. If you watch a football game, fans in the stand high-fiving each other and hugging each other when their team wins, and they have a story about their team, who's the best, who fights the other team, and who wins. And that holds people together socially. Another example I like to use is the example of Attila the Hun. So I live in Hungary, and as a Westerner, I was always taught in school that Attila the Hun was a terrible, vicious, horrible beast who murdered and plundered villages and was this awful person. And in my mind, that's who he was. That was the story I had. That was the story that my culture created to bind us together in one way and make me against the other. And then coming to Hungary and having small children, I was horrified when my mother-in-law was playing a video that was singing praises to Attila the Hun and what a wonderful person he was. And he was their savior. And they call him their sword, God's sword, Attila, God's sword. And my physical reaction was to pull my kids away and no, we're not going to teach them that Attila was a good person. He was a murderous, horrible beast. But it really opened my eyes to think about what stories we have and what side of a border they put us on and what they do to bind us socially. And also how they make the world bearable. Because can you imagine if your leader, the father of your nation, was really a terrible, horrible beast? That wouldn't feel very good. So of course, there's the story that he was a boy, a young boy who was chosen of God and given a sword from heaven to protect your people, because that's a leader that you love, and that holds you together socially with other people that you share that same story with. And it puts you against the other people from the West, like myself, who have a different story. So stories are really, really important, key to our existence as a species, key as members of a society and a culture. So physiologically, stories have implications. They make us feel good physiologically. They produce chemicals that we can feel. They give our brains structure for processing information. So chemicals such as dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin, and serotonin are all chemicals that our brain can release when we hear a story. In a story, we can see something sad. We can see something that makes us happy. And all of those emotions drive the meaning, drive the memory deeper. If you've ever wondered why some of your strongest memories are the most emotional, it's because of those chemicals that are released that make it more memorable. So in 2017, the Aspen Institute published a report that's called The Evidence-Based for How We Learn, Supporting Student Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. And in this report, the consensus statement affirms that social, emotional, and cognitive domains are interconnected in the learning process. Furthermore, they said that learning, which sparks a student's emotions, results in deeper, longer-term learning. So whenever we can have an emotional reaction from our students, whenever they're emotionally involved in a lesson, it's going to make it more meaningful. The words, the syntax, the pronunciation, anything in that moment, if it's combined with an emotion, is going to be more memorable. Furthermore, countless studies show that information is better retained when it's presented in the form of a story. And I'll try to go through these quickly. In 1969, so a long time ago, there was a study that measured measured the acquisition of vocabulary in lists or in stories. So students were asked to choose one or the other, and the group that memorized vocabulary in stories, they were able to remember 600 and 700% more, so 6 to 7 times more than the group that just memorized lists. And these studies have been repeated in lots of different contexts over time. So here we are 20 years later in 1986, where they did another study to see how young children learn best. And those young children who learned through a storytelling method retained more information than all of the other methods, including television. And it's not just for little kids. This was a study in 1995 that was done. It was a PhD dissertation that looked at college-age students. And one group was told to memorize, oh, this is the wrong one. Let me change my notes. So there were 2 groups, and they received the same information. One group through traditional lecture style classes, and the other group the same information, but in the form of a story. So tests were given immediately following class, 3 weeks later, and 5 weeks later. And the study found that twice as many people from the storytelling group remembered key points and significantly outperformed the students who received lecture style instruction. So a lot of what I'll share with you today is from the context of small children, because that's my context, that's what I teach. But please know that this is applicable, the same thing is applicable for teenagers and for adults. My favorite study is the Fijian book flood. Lots of book floods have happened where they will flood a school system with books and allow students the opportunity to read, either free voluntary reading or a teacher-fronted reading to the students. And in this particular study, sorry, just one second, I don't want to leave something out. There were 12 schools that were a part of the experiment. 8 were the experiment group and 4 were the control group. The students were in grades 4 and 5, and each grade was provided with 250 carefully selected, high-interest illustrated books. So half of the students in the experimental group did sustained silent reading, where they could choose any book that they wanted and sit and read. The other half of the group had what they called a shared book experience, where the teacher would read to them and discuss it. So students from each experimental group engaged with books for 20 to 30 minutes each day. At the end of 8 months, the book flood group had significant gains over the control group. The listening, reading, and grammar scores were almost twice as good in the book flood group. And that includes those that were reading quietly to themselves and those who were part of the group where the teacher was reading to them. And the gains in writing didn't appear for 2 years. Those came a little bit later, but again, the gains were extremely significant. I like to think of stories as a Trojan horse, really. They are the Trojan horse of grammar, syntax, vocabulary, pronunciation, intonation, with the added bonus of including content, be it academic content or social content, life lessons, new perspectives that can improve critical thinking, they can increase empathy, and develop an appreciation for diversity, all of which are crucial elements for sustainable education. So some of the ways I've highlighted here that we can use storytelling in our classes is by creating a free voluntary library, a free voluntary reading library, similar to the book flood, providing students with lots of books. And what do you do if you're in a low resource environment? That can be a really big challenge. Andy Cowell recommended to me, I was at a conference in Budapest a few years ago, and I said, I can't. Our school doesn't have money to buy 250 books. What could we possibly do? And his suggestion was have each child buy one reader, one small book, with the condition that then it belongs to the library. So they pay for one book, but then they have access to all of the books that all of the students choose. And over the years, the library will grow. I haven't implemented it yet. I did speak to the principal of my school recently, and she's in support of it. So we're going to see if we can get our own library to start to build at our school, and maybe I'll let you know someday how it goes. I don't know. But I thought that was a great suggestion for places that can't just buy 250 books or whatever the amount is off the bat. The second way I have listed here to implement stories in your classroom is to read a story. Just simply reading a story to your students is a good way to start. The difficult thing about this is finding stories that are just at the level of your students, that they can comprehend enough without having to stop and explain things, and have just enough new vocabulary that they're starting to learn more from context. So that can be tricky, but there are lots of leveled readers and stories out there. It's a matter of finding them. Another method is to tell a story, telling a story in your own words. And kids love stories. Everybody loves stories. And it can be a familiar story or even just a story from your life. On my way to school today, I was crossing the street and I saw, or whatever. And as we open up to students and tell them stories from our lives, it gives them kind of an allowance to open up to us and share experiences from their lives. The last method, ask a story, is the method that I use. And since this is the most obscure method that we're probably the least familiar with, and also because it's the method I use, this is the method I'm going to focus on and share with you today what it looks like when I ask a story with my students. So the concept of asking a story, I learned from a man named Blaine Ray, who developed a method called TPRS, which stands for Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. It was originally called TPR Storytelling, and I've seen on the website that you previously had a webinar on TPR. So TPR is the Total Physical Response method that was developed by James Asher. And the idea behind that method is to be actively engaged and have a physical reaction to language. And so Blaine Ray began using TPR with his students and had great results. And then he started adding stories to those TPR lessons. And that's how TPRS was born. Over the years, it's been built upon and added to by many amazing professionals who've made TPRS what it is today. So if you're interested in the method, there's lots of resources online. They have lots of conferences. There's lots of research supporting the method. A quick Google on YouTube, a quick Google searcher on YouTube will bring you lots of TPRS information. And I'll show you a little bit today about how I implement TPRS in my own classes. So there's 3 keys in TPRS: comprehensibility, repetition, and context. So comprehensibility is can be done in lots of different ways. Stephen Krashen recommends trying to give the input at just a level slightly above the level that your students are already at. And it can be done, to make something comprehensible can be done with TPR, an action, or using realia, bringing an object in from home, from school, from the environment, drawing pictures, looking at photographs, and probably as a last resort, using translation, if you're fortunate enough to speak the same first language as your students. Second key for TPRS is repetition. And TPRS has some specific methods that have been developed to allow for that repetition. And in a minute, I'll give just a little demonstration of what it looks like. But one way that they incorporate repetition into a lesson is through a method called circling. So if I have an item, let's just say here's a pen. So if the lesson is about, what do you call it? Like the like the topic is what's in your school bag. You know, I have a pen, I have a book, I have this and that. And so I might pick up a pen and say, you know, I have a pen, you know what? And then we want to circle around it. And so I would ask lots of questions, you know, do I have a backpack? No, it's not a backpack. Do I have a rubber or an eraser? We were just discussing before this, the difference between British English and American English. And I speak American English, but my students at school have another teacher that teaches American English. So I always want to say, do I have an eraser? And the students are confused because they say rubber. So now I'm confused in myself. So half the time I say rubber, half the time I say eraser. So then I would ask questions revolving around the pen. So they could hear the pen lots of times, not just pen, or just see it in their book as a pen. And then we might tell a story about going to school and forgetting the pen or something like that to give it a narrative context. Another way that TPRS has built in repetition into their lessons is through a method called triangling. So I would bring a student up to stand next to me and maybe ask them to bring their pen. And I would ask them, you know, do you have a pen? And they could show me their pen. And then depending on their linguistic ability, that they can say, you know, yes, I have a pen. And then I turn to the class and I say, he has a pen. And so they're getting all three, I guess this is now the triangle. They're getting the second person from me when I ask the question, the first person when the student responds, and then when I report to the class, the third person. So when I demonstrate with the actual story, you'll see that again. And then the last key element is the context, which of course is the story. So the way, when I first began asking stories from my students, so the idea is to just ask details and with their input, create a story. And a lot of times my stories just went all over the place. They didn't make any sense. There was no story arc, and kids would get upset if I took somebody's suggestion and not somebody else's. And I struggled for a long time before I found the way that I could use stories in my class that worked, that kept everybody happy. So what I do now is I use what I call a story formula. So ahead of time, I have a small idea of what the story is going to be, and that helps me stay in bounds. And with practice, it's taken a while, but with practice, I've been able to get to the point where I can know really well where the students are at and have that level. And then the +1 that Krashen talks about, I can just add a little more information. So let me show you what it's like the first day of school in first grade. So I begin with 6 words, and they're animals, because animals are concrete, they're interesting, and little kids love them. Don't forget, you can apply these same principles with older students. So we teach the word cat. I teach the word cat. I draw a really quick sketch on the board, and I give them a sign, a gesture, so that they have a little physical response, a little TPR. So they learn the word cat, they learn the word bird, fish, dog. You can't see it, but I'm patting my leg, like when you pat, come on dog. So that's dog, rabbits, and hippopotamus. Now, hippopotamus is not a word that students really need to learn, but it gets a physical response from them because they think it's hilarious. It's a fun word to say. And although hippopotamus is not the important vocabulary word, there's a whole structure that we can build around it that is important. And by making it an interesting word, it's more memorable. And so that's the fun element in this. So first, I draw the pictures, we all sign the pictures. And once we've had a little bit of repetition, then I might say cat. And instead of me modeling, I wait for their response and I delay my response, and then I will show them. But first I wait to see who is responding, bird. And I see which students quickly show me what bird means. At this stage, comprehension is more than enough. So, I mean, that's the goal, is comprehension, not production yet. So once they have a handle on those 6 words, then I add 2 verbs. And those verbs can take me many, many, many directions. So the first verb is have. And I teach them, when I show something is in my hand, that means I have it. And I translate that into Hungarian so that they know 100% exactly what I mean when I say I have. And then I have a cute little rabbit or a dog or something, and I put it in my hand and I say slowly, I have a rabbit. And so immediately from the first day, they're getting a whole sentence. It's comprehensible, it's engaging, and then we can build a story from it. So we practice with that for a while, that I have a rabbit. And when I circle around it to give more repetition, then I would say to the student sitting in front of me, you know, do you have a rabbit? And of course, you know, no, they don't have a rabbit. And then I might ask a few students, do you have a rabbit? Who, and usually I write the word who on the board, even though they're not reading yet. There are a handful of students that are, and start to kind of put the letters together with the word. I don't expect them to read it. It's just a scaffolding for those who are ready for that. And I point to who has a rabbit. You know, does John have the rabbit? And then I repeat, no, John doesn't have the rabbit. You know, Lisa Naney, that's what they call me as a teacher. Lisa Naney has the rabbit, or has a rabbit. And then I give it to somebody. That's the most exciting part of the day. And now, so I give it to John sitting there, and then I say, does Lisa Naney have the rabbit? No, Lisa Naney doesn't have the rabbit. Who has the rabbit? John has the rabbit. And we can practice with that and get lots and lots and lots of repetition. And this is the beginning of our story, but we still need lots of practice before we can move on to the actual story. We can play games. Sometimes I go out of the room and the child will give it to somebody else, and I come in and I can ask, you know, does so-and-so have the rabbit? No, they don't have the rabbit. Does this person? Until we have memorized. It's deep. They know what it means. I have a rabbit. And then from there we can move to want. And they all show me what is it like to want something, and that's their TPR, that's their physical response, want. And who wants the rabbit? And you can imagine how excited all of the students are. Everybody wants their rabbit. And we play with that for a while. So by the end, sometimes that might, depending on how engaged the students are, that might take between 1 to 3 class periods that we can play with the words have and want and animals and hiding and finding and that kind of thing. And then when they're ready, I give them each a piece of paper and I tell them to draw a picture of an animal that they want. And it's really interesting because they don't always draw animals, but it's something to start with. And and my formula basically says the student wants such and such an animal, they go to a place, then they're either going to catch it or they just get it, or maybe they buy that animal. And that's the end of our story. So these stories can start really, really simple. And then it's really easy to build on them as they're acquiring more language and as they're more familiar with what we're doing. So the very, very first story of the year might be really just that, like Annabella wants a dragon. I have it right here, actually. Annabella, this was our first story in first grade this year. She wants a dragon. So then I asked, Annabella, where will you go? Where will you go to get a dragon? And she decided she wanted to go to Budapest. So Annabella goes. We learn the word go. They have an action. Annabella stands up and she goes. John stands up and he goes. Michael can stand up and go. So we practice go for a while. Then Annabella goes to Budapest. And so once go and have and want are all automatic, then we can add more. So in this case, then I can add the word see. And we all gesture see, and we can talk about what do we see in the classroom. And so then I ask Annabella, what do you see in Budapest? And so she says, I see buildings, I see a bridge. And so then we pull the story out from it that Annabella wants a dragon. She goes to Budapest. She sees a bridge. The dragon is on the bridge. The dragon is sad because we were also having, I'm trying to think of how that detail got in. We were having emotional songs at the beginning, good morning, I'm happy, I'm sad, or whatever. So they knew the word sad. So the dragon was sad. So Annabella gets the dragon. Now they're friends and she was happy. And that was Annabella's story that we created at the beginning of the year. And from then there out, we can build. So then the next story, I think I have this on my next slide. So this is Bennett's picture. Bennett drew 2 tigers, and this was actually, I think, our 3rd story. And so by then we had go and see was really easy for the kids. So I started to add a mode of transportation. So Bennett wants 2 tigers, and this was a good place to stop. Where can you get a tiger? Can you get a tiger? Okay, from the zoo, but not from the hills in Hungary, but you can also go to India. So we pulled up the map, and this is India. This is where Hungary is. This is where India is. There are tigers in India. And so then we added, the important thing that we added after that was modes of transportation. So then I asked Bennett, how will you go to India? And he was so excited because he wanted to drive a 4x4. So Bennett drives a 4x4 to India. And that was the story. So from this really simple formula and one picture from the student, you can build out a lot of stories. It's really helped me to have a formula to kind of guide me. I'm just trying to see. This was just a funny one because the student drew a shark, and then there were Coca-Cola, and it was the ocean, but he drew Coca-Cola bottles in the ocean, and he said that little character was the Coca-Cola king. And so some really, really strange and interesting and fun things can come out of it. And even though Coca-Cola is not an important SEFR level A1 vocabulary word, that wasn't really the important thing. There was all of the grammar structures that are built around it that the students acquire. And they have that emotional engagement and the attachment because the learning is now theirs. They're invested in it and they're interested in it. After I ask the story, then I pull out the vocabulary that's new, and then I put it in a little piece of paper like this for the students. And I don't really expect them to read it in first grade, but we hold on to these. And by the time they're in second grade and third grade, they definitely will be able to read these. And English is really hard in Hungary for students to read because Hungarian is so phonetic. And I don't know what your situation is like, but when they see English, it's just the weirdest thing for them. And they like to pronounce English words with the Hungarian phonetics, and it causes a lot of challenges. But I find that it's helpful for the students to read something that they're so familiar with, because we tell the story, I circle around the story, Bennett will stand up next to me and I can ask him, Bennett, do you want a tiger? Do you want 3 tigers or do you want 1 tiger? How many tigers do you want? And turn to the class and say, Bennett wants 2 tigers. So they're hearing that so many times by the time we get through a story, and then he acts it out, and maybe two little kids are acting out the tigers and what does he see along the way, and those kind of things. So they've acted it, they've heard it, and so then when they go to read it, it's much easier. Returning to the theoretical, stories are fun and stories feel good, but it's more than that. It's more than just a fun thing to do. There really are cognitive and academic benefits to it. So Mary Helen Imordino Yang is a neurobiologist, and she's done a lot of research on, the neurobiology that's happening during learning. And here, I'll read it from here. She says, while there are no silver bullets in education, emotional engagement and personal relevance is the tool that has the potential to improve the educational experience for every child in every school. So I would like these three keys to emulate these three key points: that when learning is memorable, relevant, and personal, the learning goes deeper. Seymour Papert said that children learn best when they're actively engaged in constructing something that has personal meaning to them, be it a poem, a robot, a sandcastle, or a computer game. And I can attest to this, that my students, since I started using stories and since I started using formulas where every day it's somebody else's story, they're so excited and they can't wait. When is it going to be my story? And they're much more invested in the learning. So there was a report that came out from a group of academics. It's called a NISM report. And what they were highlighting is that the importance of engaging the imagination of learners is really worth the effort. The outcomes are worth the effort that we put in when we engage the imagination. It's not easy. It really is hard. It's a lot easier to rely on a textbook that's already written and everything's there. We know what's going to happen from the beginning to the end. When we engage in imagination of a child, it's so unpredictable and we really don't know where it's going to go, but it is worth it. And with practice, we can learn how to kind of keep their imagination in bounds for teaching language. This is my story formula for second grade. It's a little bit more complicated, but not that much. So the formula is that there's a character that wants or has an object, I don't know, ahead of time, and they go to a certain place, and then they end up somehow with an object. I didn't pull any of these examples out ahead of time. So, I have one on the next slide, I think. There we go. So this is what one of my boys in second grade drew this year. And there he is. His name is Arlen, and he wanted a lion. And so he went to the pyramids in Egypt and found a cupboard, a wardrobe, and he really wanted spaghetti. So he went to get spaghetti, and he ended up with a hamburger, which is in the last picture. So it's silly. It's not really deep and meaningful, but again, it's the emotional connection. It's the personalization. It's him being invested in his learning. And we got lots of good words about food and what foods do you like to eat, and spaghetti and hamburgers and pizza. And then we talked about, prepositions of place, in the cupboard, behind the cupboard, under the cupboard. And so you can really, with something small like this, you can adjust the level in and out to match where your students are at. Let me make sure I said everything I wanted to say. So when my students are a little bit older, and here's his story all typed out, I don't have the picture dictionary in. I put the words in English and they write the translation into Hungarian and draw a picture. So they start to create their own picture dictionary. This is my story formula for grade 3 that has a character, a place, an object, and an action. So when the students are in first grade and I ask them to draw the animal, they have no idea that it's going to become a story. And by the time they get to second grade, I would say about half of them know at the beginning of the year when I give them a paper and start telling them what to draw, they kind of get that it's going to be a story. And it's nice when they don't know it's going to be a story and they just put random things on the paper. So I would tell them, you know, in the first square, draw a character. It can be anything. It can be real. It can be made up. And then in the second place, draw a place. It can be a big place, a small place, any place, an imaginary place, and so on with the object and the action. And they don't know necessarily what the formula is that I have in mind. And these formulas can, well, if you looked at all of the stories that came out from one formula, you would have no idea that they were related because sometimes they just go in so many directions. It just helps me. And there's certain elements of a good story, right? You need a character, you need a place, you need some type of action and conflict and a resolution. And so having these in place helps me make a more complete story that doesn't just wind and wind forever. For grade 4, it gets a little more complicated, where we have multiple characters, multiple places, and multiple objects. And to tell you honestly, I think I prefer this formula even all the way up to grade 8. So last year I taught grades 1 through 8. This year I'm just in 1 through 4. So this is the formula I was using up to grade 8 last year. Sometimes when there's so many details that have to be included in the story, it can get more challenging than if I just have 4 basic simple details, and then we are more free to expand and move in more directions that way. So it looks like I'm going over time, so I'm sorry. Let me go really fast through this last part. So ways to preserve these stories: you can preserve them for future reading libraries if you don't have one. And I also compile from all the papers that I print off for my students, I compile a little booklet that they can take home at the end of the year that has a collection of all of their stories. I used to have them do it in their own notebooks, but that was hit and miss with kids leaving notebooks at home and them getting destroyed sometimes. And so this way at the end of the year, I have them collected. I have a master notebook, and sometimes I might have like a master artist that will draw the picture for the stories. And then if I want to have a free voluntary reading moment at the beginning of class, I can pass out students' individual books or the master notebook to somebody who maybe didn't have one of these for whatever reason. PowerPoint presentations, I can put their pictures up on a PowerPoint presentation and project it, which when I have time, it's really nice because they can see the pictures clearly while I'm asking the details from the student. The others can see it better. Sometimes I'll make a video recording when the students act out a story, and then we can watch it later for more repetition and for fun when we have extra time. And this last one, if you want to make a note, Adobe Spark Video is a free video editor that's so simple and really easy to use. And I often make Spark videos of these. I just upload the pictures and then I can record the students' voices, which is the advantage to that. And it helps them practice their pronunciation. And then we can watch it later on for fun when we have those extra minutes at the end of class. So I promised that I would give suggestions of how to use these stories further for focused skills-based learning. So let me just move my camera or my recording, I can't see. So one of my favorite listening activities is to read a story but with wrong details, and the students fill in the right details as I read. So, you know, Bennett wants 5 tigers, and no, Bennett wants 2 tigers. You know, he goes to Africa, no, India. So that's a fun one for them to fill in the right details. A word dance for focus listening, having them say, okay, every time I say the word they, which is really hard for them to pick out in Hungarian. It doesn't have a lot of significance because they don't start their sentences with they go because it's conjugated into the verb. So every time you hear the word they, you know, do a dance or raise your hand or something like that. A TPR story is when, as I say the story, from their desk sitting down, they can do all of the actions. So he wants a cat, he goes, etc. And the other favorite listening activities, having them stand up and act it out while I say it, because then they're focusing on listening and understanding, and they don't have to produce anything. And then I can also mix up the details and say, okay, now we're going to do this story, but listen extra carefully because I might tell you a different way. Speaking activities, if there's dialogue in the story, having the students practice the dialogue part in pair work is good. A point of view retell. So we have the story from Bennett's point of view. Can you retell the story from the tiger's point of view? So where was the tiger? What was he doing? What did he think of Bennett when Bennett came to get him? Giving advice to a character. What advice would you give Bennett before he goes on a trip? These are not things I use in grade 1, mind you. these are for kids with a much more advanced vocabulary. I'm just basing it on that story example that I gave. And then acting out. When kids are older and can produce language, they can act out and say the parts or narrate it. Reading activities, scanning for detail. So my little ones, when they're just learning how to read, I might say, okay, look for the word water, circle every time you see the word water. So they're starting to learn how to scan and recognize the letters and the words. Asking them to read it in a funny voice. If I feel like they're struggling and we need more time reading, it's fun to have them do it in a funny voice. And they don't even know they're in language class. They're having so much fun being silly and using these funny voices. But they get a ton of reading practice that way. And the other kids giggle while they follow along. A free voluntary reading library, of course, for reading practice. And having them take a story home and tell them to read it to someone special. You know, a neighbor, a friend, a parent, a relative, or a pet even. Oh. And for writing exercises, again, for older students, you can have them change the ending, that you can have them rewrite the entire story, copy it down, but changing details. And then that could be a reading activity after they could read it to a friend, classmate. Rewrite the story by changing the tense and write background details, perhaps details that are insignificant to the story. You know, what was Bennett wearing when he went to India? Or what did the jungle look like? And they can add those types of details in. So that's my other favorite writing activity for older kids. That's an incomplete reference list. I didn't quite finish yet. And that's really the end. I really hope that this has been useful, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Lisa. You've provided such a nice presentation for storytelling. Actually, I've made so many discoveries, and you have approached it from so many angles that we now look at stories from different perspectives. It's not just you tell, they listen. It's just so many skills are involved, and I'm happy that we had you like after some of our previous speakers, because they were talking about total physical response, and you covered that. Our audience already know about that. We had a session on competency based. We had on context based. So you have all provided those, and we had a comment from a participant who is saying that thank you for the activities that can be used in low resource EFL classes. We also had one webinar on this, how to teach English and with low limited resources. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And I personally learned a lot from this webinar. Thank you. So we have got a question. Do you use comic stories as well? And if yes, for which grades?
I've never used comics, but those would be great. There's a lot of action in comics, and there are some comics written at quite low levels as well. So yeah, but I just haven't.
Mm-hmm. So do you, Liz, ask also your students, the children, to bring their toy, like animals, to class and create a story with them?
I haven't, but that would be a really great idea. I used to at the very beginning when we did the have and the want, I would ask parents to send me pictures of students with their pets, and I would make a PowerPoint presentation and talk about you know, which pets everybody has. And if they didn't have a pet, they could take a picture of a stuffed animal or whatever. So I have done in the past. It's been a while though. I don't know why.
So we have got another question from Parvina. She's asking, could you give some ideas to use for university students?
Ooh, I've never used this method with anybody over grade 8, but there are a lot of people who do. A lot of people. If you Google TPRS, or if you want to write down the name Jeff Brown. Jeff Brown is a Spanish teacher. He's a polyglot. He speaks 9 languages. He has a really nice YouTube video about TPRS, and he's interviewed Stephen Krashen, and he teaches at a university in Southern California. And the stories there are on a different level than mine as far as the complexity goes, but the principles are the same. You know, if I don't know, if in your curriculum you have to teach a certain structure, let's say we're learning past participles, and maybe you have some specific vocabulary in your textbook, I would use that as a starting point and say, okay, we want to practice the past participle, and this is some vocabulary we're working on, and then try to create a story. You know, if you can give it a little start and then ask details from your student. Okay, here's this person, and he had gone to, you know, where, and then they give you the detail of where, and then, you know, what happened, what did they see, what popped up, what. So really the same, but yeah, I can't give a more specific example because I haven't done it at that grade, but it's definitely doable.
Yeah, I think the formula 4 that you provided, that could be also somehow related to the university level, like learners. Like you mentioned, the conflict resolution and all those, they're more kind of for, I mean, they can be used for both, but mostly for the adult learners. So I saw your formula 4, and I think that could be also applicable for the adult learners.
Yeah.
So we have got a question from Anisha. She's asking, is that possible to share some picture books?
Is it possible for me to share picture books right now, or to share pictures?
Yeah, you can share them with us. Because we are posting everything on our website, we have this recorded webinar. They can watch it later, and also your PowerPoint presentation. We will provide this with our participants. And if you can have the links for the resources, we can put those too.
I'm not able to share any actual books because I don't have the copyright to them, but a lot of books are read on YouTube. So if you have access to a computer and a projector, if you can use YouTube in your class, videos on YouTube make really, really great narratives, really great stories. And what I do, it's a technique that's used in TPRS called movie talk, which is, disclaimer, actually the name originated from somebody who does not do TPRS, but I have forgotten her name. But there are other English teachers, Jamie Kitty, who uses a lot of YouTube videos in his lessons. And what I do, and most TPRS practitioners, is turn off the sound for the video. And so you're just watching the action, and then you can narrate it and you pause, So I use, for my little ones, I use, what's it called? Simon's Cat. And so there's the Simon Cat, where, I don't know if you're familiar, who's familiar with Simon's Cat? It's one of the original YouTube, a big YouTube thing. They're just short 60-second animated clips about, there's a man, Simon, and he has a cat. And they're great because there's no dialogue in it. It's just all between a man and a cat. And so when there's no dialogue, it's all just action driven. So we might watch 3 seconds and then I pause it, and where is Simon? Where is the cat? Simon, what is Simon doing? He's sleeping. Is the cat sleeping? No, the cat's not sleeping. What does the cat want? And then, we watch 3 more seconds. Oh, the cat, he was jumping on Simon, so who's sleeping? Is the cat sleeping, or is Simon jumping or sleeping? And, we circle, we get the repetition, and we narrate it as it moves along. So that's like a built-in story that all I have to do is give the kids the language. And I love the technique because I can go from 1st grade to 4th grade. I can use the same video clip, but with 4th grade, we can talk about a whole lot more than we did for first grade. So if any of you do really older kids, there's a really good video called Mr. Indifferent. And Mr. Indifferent, when I just demoed this with a group of teachers, and my colleague teaches older students, and she was like, I was so curious how you use it with little kids because it's kind of adultish. But Mr. Indifferent has his hands in his pockets the whole time. And so that's all I want my students to learn is, where are his hands? In his pockets. And then we have a whole game where I say, okay, put something in your pocket, and then we guess what's in their pockets, and we talk about that. But so the whole, it has a really nice message, but you could use it with university students with any age. And there's this guy who always has his hands in his pockets, and he doesn't hold the elevator for the woman that needs to get in, and he doesn't sign up to volunteer, and he doesn't catch a balloon for a little girl in the park. And then eventually, I won't give it away, but eventually he learns that his hands are powerful. And there's a point where he's looking at his hands in the video, and my colleague said, I never even realized he looked at his hands. So she teaches the video, but she has a completely different lesson for her older students than I do with mine, because hands and pockets are really concrete for little third, fourth, second graders, and they can do a lot more. So anyway, he recognizes he has hands, and then eventually he starts helping people. So yeah, videos that don't have dialogue, that are just action, are great narratives and can be used with the same technique.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Liz. The next question is how to make students read stories with complicated vocabulary.
Well, starting from the beginning and building up, you have to go all the way down to where they're comprehensive, and then build on that. The more they read, the more complicated texts they'll be able to read, and eventually they'll be able to read the more complicated ones. So one step at a time.
Our last question is, how much do you highlight universal values when you do storytelling besides the language component?
That's a hard question to answer. I base everything I do off of what my students want to talk about. So every once in a while, really important issues will come up from stories. I had one girl who drew her dogs. They were very important to her, and the story was about telling them, to sit and to come. And then by the end, she told us that her dogs had died, and it was like an emotional thing for her. And these stories were really, really important, and it gave us a chance to really bond actually as a class over that story, and kind of, we didn't get really deep into it, but we were able to comfort her and feel empathy for her and experience that in class. So, we can go anywhere from a Coca-Cola king in the ocean to real meaningful stories. It just depends on what the students, where they're at and what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Liz, for such a wonderful presentation. Today we learned a lot from you about storytelling and techniques, approaches. Thank you for volunteering with us, and we really hope for future collaborations with you and to have maybe another webinar in the future. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.